You may think it's just a quick bite, but what happens when you choose the wrong place to eat? Here's why you should never eat in just any restaurant, according to African wisdom. One cold, windy evening, a hungry crowd stood outside Madame Ifeoma's grilled meat and pepper soup joint in the heart of Nsukka, their noses flaring as the thick, tantalizing aroma of roasted meat and spicy pepper soup filled the air. It danced around them like an invisible rope pulling them closer. The scent was so powerful that some stomachs growled loudly, causing embarrassed laughter among the waiting customers. It was like magic, the way the aroma wrapped around their senses, making their mouths water uncontrollably. The line stretched long, curving around the corner, as people pushed each other just to get closer. Nobody wanted to miss a taste of her famous grilled meat, garnished with flavorful pepper and onions that shimmered with oil under the flickering street lights. The roasted meat looked so succulent, dripping with juice that sizzled as it hit the hot coals. And the pepper soup. Oh, the pepper soup. Its rich, spicy scent could make a fasting monk break his fast. It was said to be the best in town, better than anything any other food seller could prepare. Madame Ifeoma's place was the talk of Nsukka. People traveled from distant villages just to eat there. Some wealthy men and politicians would park their flashy cars by the roadside and join the queue, not minding their status. Big market traders, who usually had no time for anything else, would close their shops early just to grab a plate. Mothers would wake up before dawn, rushing to buy food for their children's school lunch. Men abandoned their wives cooking at home, forming excuses just to eat at Madame Ifeoma's grilled meat and pepper soup joint. Today the crowd was restless, their eyes fixed on the door. A young man at the front of the line complained, "Why hasn't she opened yet? I've been here since before the crowd." His voice was filled with impatience, but no one blamed him. The wait was torture with the delicious scent teasing their noses. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Madame Ifeoma appeared. She was a tall, chubby woman with piercing eyes that seemed to look right through people. Her face held no smile, just a cold expression that made her look like she was always in deep thought. "Please, everyone should chill well. I will not sell to anyone if the line is scattered," she commanded in a sharp voice. The crowd immediately straightened up, not wanting to offend her and lose their chance to eat her food. Inside the restaurant, strange things were happening behind the closed kitchen doors. Pots clanked and ladles stirred in boiling soups, but no one was there. The fire under the grills burned fiercely, roasting meats that turned golden brown, dripping juices into the flames with loud hisses. Invisible hands moved around, mixing spices, seasoning meats, and planting them neatly. It was as if spirits were cooking. Madame Ifeoma stood at the doorway, her eyes glowing with a strange light as she watched the unseen beings work. She never cooked alone, even though nobody ever saw anyone helping her. In the dead of the night when the world was asleep, she would sneak out to meet her secret suppliers, Igui and Chijioke, the men who sold her the freshest parts. With each delivery, they whispered in harsh voices, their eyes nervously darting around. "Madam, this is the best one, it's still very fresh," one of them would say, handing over a blood-stained sack and a gallon of water used in bathing the dead. She would smile a cold, wicked smile that could freeze water and drop a thick envelope of cash in their hands. They never asked questions, and neither did she. She never tasted her own food, not even a single bite. Instead, she ate only fruits and bought food from other vendors. But nobody ever wondered why. Perhaps it was because her meals were laced with powerful chants that clouded their minds, making them crave her food endlessly without questions. Outside, the crowd grew restless again. The door swung open, and Madame Ifeoma began serving plates after plates. She dished out steaming pepper soup, grilled meat glistening with oil, and roasted meat garnished with onions and pepper. The crowd devoured the food eagerly, their faces lighting up with satisfaction. But nobody knew the dark secret behind the delicious taste. Nobody knew the truth about Madame Ifeoma. Not yet. As the crowd devoured the meat, a man exclaimed, "This pepper soup is everything," wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "No other place can cook like this." His friend nodded, chewing loudly on a piece of grilled meat. Look at the way it melts in the mouth. What kind of meat is this? He wondered. But the question quickly vanished from his mind as he took another bite. Unknown to them, the meat they enjoyed so much wasn't from any animal. It was from the freshest human parts, carefully selected and prepared in the dead of the night. How did Madame Ifeoma learn such a dark and deadly recipe? Many years ago, she was known as Adeku, a beautiful woman with a bright future. She was born in the same village where she now ran her restaurant, but back then, her life was full of sorrow and pain. Her mother died while giving birth to her, and her father passed away mysteriously when she was only 5. Some said he was poisoned. Others whispered he died of a broken heart. Either way, Adeku was left alone and orphaned with no one to care for her. The villagers believed she was cursed. Bad luck follows that one like a shadow, they would say, crossing to the other side of the road whenever she walked by. Even the children avoided her, calling her names and throwing stones. She grew up lonely, isolated, and hated. But the worst pain came when she got married. She fell in love with Chidi, a hard-working farmer who didn't care about the rumors surrounding her. They lived happily for a while, but tragedy struck again. One by one, their children died mysteriously, never surviving past their first year. It was as if death had made her its favorite companion. When her husband Chidi also died suddenly, the villagers became convinced that she was cursed. She's cursed. Everyone around her dies. They shouted, accusing her of being a witch, claiming she had sacrificed her own family to evil spirits. In their anger and fear, they banished her from the village, chasing her out with sticks and stones. Don't ever come back, they warned, throwing her belongings at her as she walked away in tears. She wandered through the thick forest, crying and cursing her fate. Why me? What did I do to deserve this? She sobbed, her voice echoing in the emptiness. As night fell, the forest grew cold and dark. Strange sounds echoed from the shadows, old hoods rustling, leaves stirring, and the howls of wild animals. Adeku shivered, hugging herself as she sat on a fallen log, her eyes swollen from crying. Her stomach rumbled, but there was no food, no shelter, no hope. Just when she thought she would die in that forest, an old woman appeared before her. The woman's hair was white as snow, her face wrinkled like dried leaves, and her eyes glowed with a strange, otherworldly light. She wore tattered clothes, and her feet didn't touch the ground. "Why do you cry, child?" the old woman asked, her voice hollow and echoing. Adeku jumped back, her fear tightening her throat. Who are you?" she stammered. The old woman smiled, revealing sharp, yellow teeth. "I am someone who can end your pain if you want me to." Her words were soft but heavy, carrying a promise of something dark and powerful. Adeku's eyes widened. "End my pain," she whispered. The old woman leaned closer, her eyes burning like fire. "Those who wronged you, would you like to make them suffer? Would you like to take revenge on all who caused you pain?" Revenge! The word echoed in Adeku's mind, filling her heart with anger and bitterness. She remembered the faces of the villagers, the ones who mocked her, the ones who accused her, the ones who threw stones and banished her. "Yes," she whispered, her fist tightening. "I want them to suffer. I want them to feel my pain." The old woman's smile grew wider. "Then follow me." The old woman led Adeku deep into the forest to a riverside, where the water was dark and still, reflecting the crescent moon like a silver blade. There, at the edge of the water, stood 3 tall figures, their faces hidden under black hoods. They chanted softly, their voices blending with the wind, sending chills down Adeku's spine. The old woman gestured for Adeku to step forward. "Kneel," she commanded, her voice echoing across the water. Adeku obeyed, her heart pounding as cold mud seeped into her knees. One of the hooded figures stepped forward, holding a clay pot filled with a thick, dark liquid. He poured it over Adeku's head, and she felt a burning sensation as it ran down her face, soaking her hair and clothes. She wanted to scream, but her voice was gone. The old woman began chanting in an ancient language, her words rising and falling like a haunting melody. From this day on, you shall no longer be Adiku. You shall be reborn with power, strength, and vengeance. You shall be known as Madam Ifeoma Cho Fingers. As the words echoed into the night, the water in the river began to bubble. The figures chanted louder, their voices blending with the wind, as the air around them seemed to shimmer and crackle. Adiku felt herself changing, her body growing cold and heavy, as visions blurred and faded into darkness. She collapsed, sinking into the mud, as the darkness swallowed her. When she woke up, she was no longer the same. Her face had changed, her voice was different, and her heart had become cold, void of love or mercy. She was no longer Adiku, the cursed widow. She was Madam Ifeoma Cho Fingers, the woman who would make the villagers pay for all they had done to her. With her new identity and supernatural powers, Madam Ifeoma returned to Nsukka. Nobody recognized her. Nobody knew she was the same woman they had banished years ago. She set up her restaurant in the same spot, and soon it became the most popular eatery in town. One by one, she drove other food sellers out of business. Madam Ifeoma's grilled meat and pepper soup joint became the talk of the town and beyond. From dawn to dusk, people lined up to eat, drawn by the irresistible aroma that floated through the air like an invisible hand pulling them in. Madam Ifeoma stood behind the counter, her face masked with a warm, welcoming smile, serving plates of steaming pepper soup, spicy grilled meat, and jollof fries. Her fingers moved swiftly, dishing out meals with practiced ease, yet nobody ever saw her taste a single morsel of her food. She never licked her fingers or sampled her cooking. Instead, she only ate fruits, nibbling quietly at the corner of her shop, her eyes always watching her customers like a predator studying its prey. One regular customer, Namdi, the son of a wealthy merchant, loved her food almost obsessively. "Madam Ifeoma, please add extra meat," he shouted, waving his money in the air. "Your meat is too delicious. It's addictive," he would joke, his laughter echoing across the room. Madam Ifeoma smiled wider, piling more roasted meat on his plate. "Eat well, my son, eat and grow strong," she said, her voice soft but carrying an undercurrent of darkness. Behind her kind words was a truth that no one knew. Each bite was a curse, a silent price that would soon be paid. At first, Madam Ifeoma's food seemed like a blessing, irresistibly delicious, filling and addictive. But those who ate it for long periods began to experience strange, unexplainable misfortunes. The effect didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly, like a silent curse, wrapping its fingers around their lives. Namdi was the first to experience it. One night, he woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding wildly. In his dream, he had been running through a dark forest, chased by something he couldn't see. It was fast, its footsteps heavy and loud, snapping branches and rustling leaves. No matter how fast he ran, it got closer, hot breath brushing his neck. Just as it grabbed him, he woke up screaming, his body shaking with fear. The next day he laughed it off. "Just a nightmare," he told his friends, but his eyes were sunken and his face was pale. He tried to forget about it, but the dreams continued, growing worse each night. Soon he stopped sleeping, terrified of the dark forest and the creatures that chased him. But the nightmares were only the beginning. A week later, Namdi began to lose weight. His once muscular frame became thin and frail. His cheeks hollowed and his body wasted away, his skin clinging to his bones. People noticed his condition and whispered among themselves. "It's like he's caught a disease," they said, shaking their heads in pity. "See how dry he looks." His parents took him to the best hospitals, but the doctors were baffled. "There's nothing wrong with him," they said, scratching their heads. "He's perfectly healthy, yet he's wasting away." They prescribed vitamins and a special diet, but nothing worked. His health continued to deteriorate, and one evening Namdi collapsed. By the time they carried him to the hospital, he was dead. Namdi's death shook the whole village, but it didn't stop people from eating at Madam Ifeoma's restaurant. Her food was too delicious, too addictive. The more they ate, the more they craved it. It was as if her food had cast a spell on them. Madame Ifeoma watched it all from behind her counter. Her face remained impassive, her eyes cold and unfeeling. She knew exactly what was happening to her customers. Her supernatural powers allowed her to see everything, even their dreams, the nightmares, the cravings, the illness. It was all part of the curse that came with eating her food. It was her revenge. Her way of making the villagers suffer for what they had done to her. She took pleasure in their misery, her heart hardened by years of pain and rejection. But she wasn't done yet. Her vengeance had only just begun, and she would not stop until they all paid their price. Madame Ifeoma's business continued to boom. People were addicted to her food, unable to stop eating even as they watched their loved ones suffer. She stood behind her counter, serving them with a smile, her eyes gleaming with wicked satisfaction. But her reign of terror was about to end. Among the food vendors she had driven out of business was Cecilia, a woman known for her ritual gifts. She was the only one who could see beyond Madame Ifeoma's charms. Cecilia had always been different. Since childhood, she had been able to sense the hidden layers of the world around her. She could see what others couldn't, feel what others didn't. She had known from the very first moment she tasted Madame Ifeoma's food that something was wrong. There was something dark woven into each bite, something unsettling beneath the perfect seasoning and the tender meat. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, but over time she realized she wasn't mistaken. Cecilia's curiosity grew as she watched the villagers flock to Madame Ifeoma's restaurant, day after day, as if under some kind of spell. The vibrant health of many of them had slowly withered, but no one seemed to make the connection. The nightmares, the illnesses, the strange misfortunes. No one questioned the link to Madame Ifeoma's food. One night, Cecilia decided to follow Madame Ifeoma. She had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. Under the cover of darkness, Cecilia trailed the woman she had come to suspect of causing the villagers suffering. Madame Ifeoma moved with an unnatural grace, her feet barely touching the ground, her posture slightly hunched, as if carrying a secret weight. Cecilia followed her through narrow alleys, across fields, and into the dense woods. The night air grew cooler, and the sounds of the village slowly faded into the background. Soon they were deep in the forest, far from the prying eyes of the village. Cecilia stayed hidden, watching with wide eyes as Madame Ifeoma met two men in the clearing. They were dressed in black hooded robes, their faces obscured in shadow. The exchange was quiet but intense, filled with hushed voices and furtive glances. Cecilia crept closer, the crunch of leaves underfoot sounding deafening in the silence. She watched as the men handed Madame Ifeoma a sack covered in dark stains, and a gallon of murky water that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Cecilia's stomach churned, her worst fears beginning to take shape. She saw them exchange the goods, but it was the look on Madame Ifeoma's face that made her freeze. A cold, calculated smile spread across her lips as she tucked the sack into her bag. There was no doubt now. Cecilia knew what was inside the sack. It was the very thing that had been haunting her, human parts. Before she could take a breath, Madame Ifeoma turned sharply, as if sensing her presence. Cecilia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Madame Ifeoma's eyes gleamed with a sharp, predatory focus. "You've seen too much," she said, her voice soft but filled with menace. "But you are too weak to stop me." Cecilia's legs quivered beneath her, but she forced herself to step back, to run. She had to warn the village. She had to expose Madame Ifeoma before anyone else fell victim to her dark secrets. The next morning Cecilia wasted no time. She went straight to the village elders, telling them everything she had witnessed the night before. Her voice was urgent, filled with a mix of fear and determination. "Madame Ifeoma is using human parts in her food. She's poisoning all of you, casting a spell on your minds, and turning you into addicts to her food." At first, the elders didn't believe her. They had grown accustomed to hearing wild accusations and rumors. But Cecilia's insistence wore them down, and eventually, They agreed to confront Madame Ifeoma. A group of angry men was assembled, ready to take matters into their own hands. The mob marched to Madame Ifeoma's restaurant, their faces twisted in anger and fear. They had come to take action, to put an end to the witchcraft that had plagued their village. When they reached the restaurant, they began banging on the doors, demanding to be let in. Madame Ifeoma, calm as always, stood behind her counter, her eyes glowing with that same strange light. "What is this disturbance?" she asked in her cold, measured voice. The mob barged in, tearing through the doors. What they found inside stunned them into silence. In the large fridge, hidden behind the neatly arranged sacks of vegetables and packets of meat, were human parts of all kinds: arms, legs, heads, arranged like regular cuts of meat. There were bones, floating in jars of liquid, and containers filled with dark water from the morgue. The air was thick with the stench of death, causing some of the men to vomit on the spot. The realization hit them hard. The food they had been consuming, the meat that they had devoured with such relish, was human flesh. The villagers screamed in horror as they backed away from the fridge. Some collapsed, their hands clutching at their throats as they tried to vomit out the cursed food, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. Their bodies had been poisoned, their minds manipulated, and they had unwittingly become part of Madame Ifeoma's twisted revenge. She watched them, her cold, unfeeling eyes taking in their terror. "You all thought you were so clever," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "But you never bothered to ask what was truly in my food. Now you will pay for your ignorance." The villagers were horrified. The truth had finally come to light, and it was more monstrous than anything they had imagined. Madame Ifeoma was dragged out of her restaurant, her supernatural disguise fading away as the villagers exposed her for who she truly was. Adiku, the banished widow, the woman who had cursed them all. Her once beautiful face had twisted into something monstrous, her features warped by years of pain and bitterness. The cold, ruthless expression on her face was the only thing that remained unchanged. The mob beat her mercilessly, but she didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She simply let them do it, her heart full of satisfaction. She had made them pay. But as the villagers prepared to burn her alive, the police arrived. They had been tipped off by an anonymous informant, and they quickly intervened, arresting Madame Ifeoma before the mob could do any more damage. Her restaurant was destroyed, the food burned to ashes, and the spell that had been cast over the villagers was finally broken. Slowly, the effects of the curse began to wear off, and the villagers started to recover. Madame Ifeoma was taken away, her reign of terror at an end. But even as the police took her into custody, there was something unsettling about her. Her eyes never left the crowd, and a cold, twisted smile played on her lips. "You may have stopped me," she whispered, "but you'll never stop the hunger." As she was carted away, the villagers stood in silence, looking at each other in disbelief. They had been living in a nightmare, and now they were free. But the memory of Madame Ifeoma's food, its strange, addictive allure, would haunt them forever. The villagers learned a hard lesson that day. Not all food is what it seems. Sometimes the source is darker than you could ever imagine, and the people behind it are not always what they appear to be. From that day forward, the villagers of Nsukka were more cautious. They began to question the source of their food, to be mindful of what they consumed. No longer would they blindly trust the alluring aroma of food, for they knew that sometimes, the price of a meal could be far greater than they ever imagined. As Madame Ifeoma's arrest sent shockwaves through the village, a lingering unease settled over the residents of Nsukka. Despite the physical destruction of her restaurant and the burning of her cursed meals, the truth of what had transpired began to slowly sink in. For years they had been unknowingly feeding on human flesh, their minds clouded by an insidious force. The nightmares, the unexplainable illnesses, and the misfortunes, they had all been a part of the dark spell woven by Madame Ifeoma. Now that the truth had been exposed, many were left to grapple with the unsettling reality that they had been complicit in their own torment. The elders, too, were shaken. They had been the ones who welcomed Madame Ifeoma back into the village all those years ago, blind to the darkness that had followed her. They had believed in the fairy tale of redemption, thinking that the woman they had cast out could somehow come back and be a force for good. But now, as the full extent of her evil was revealed, they were left to carry the heavy burden of their own naivety. The village council called for a meeting, a chance for them to address the community and ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. The council hall was filled to capacity, the air thick with the weight of recent revelations. The villagers, who had once been so eager to flock to Madame Ifeoma's restaurant, now sat in silence, their faces a mixture of anger, guilt, and sorrow. They were joined by the elders, who had called the meeting to discuss what should be done to restore the village's sense of security. "Today we have learned a terrible truth about one of our own," Elder Namdi said, his voice somber as he stood before the crowd. "Madame Ifeoma, Adeku as she was once known, has poisoned our people not just with her food, but with her evil intentions. She turned our hunger into a weapon, preying on our desires, feeding us lies and curses. And for that we must ensure that we rebuild, not just physically, but spiritually." The room was quiet, save for the occasional soft murmur of agreement. Many in the crowd had been loyal patrons of Madame Ifeoma's, and the weight of their actions weighed heavily on their hearts. They had eaten from her plates, they had enjoyed her food, and now they knew the true cost. The villagers' appetite for pleasure had been their undoing. They had been consumed not just by the taste of the food, but by the illusion of satisfaction. And now, with the truth revealed, they were left with nothing but empty plates and the bitter taste of regret. Elder Namdi continued, "We must cleanse our village of this curse. It's not enough to tear down her restaurant. We must rid ourselves of the darkness that has taken root in our hearts. For too long we have been blinded by our own desires. We have allowed greed and convenience to guide us. It's time to return to the values that once made this village strong." A murmur of agreement swept through the room, though some remained quiet, unsure of what this cleansing would truly entail. There were rumors of rituals, whispers of traditional remedies that could remove evil from the land. But the reality was that the village was not prepared for the depth of Madame Ifeoma's curse. What would it take to rid themselves of the poison she had spread? "Who among us has been affected?" Elder Uche asked, his voice a bit shaky. "Who can we trust to lead us through this darkness? And how do we heal the minds that were clouded by Madame Ifeoma's magic?" His question was one that many had been wondering, but no one had an answer. It was at that moment that Cecilia stood up. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with conviction. She had been one of the few who had dared to speak out about the truth, and she could not allow the villagers to continue in their ignorance. "I may not have the answers," Cecilia said, her voice steady but filled with passion, "but I know that we must start by acknowledging the wrongs we have done. We cannot change the past, but we can choose how we move forward. I have seen the effects of Madame Ifeoma's food firsthand. I have watched people deteriorate both physically and mentally. But we must also ask ourselves, how many more of us are still caught in the web of her lies? How many of us still crave her food, despite knowing the truth?" A heavy silence fell over the room. The question was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. Cecilia was right. Many of them still longed for the taste of Madame Ifeoma's food, even after learning what it had truly been. That craving, that addiction, had been imprinted on their minds like an indelible mark. How could they rid themselves of it? Elder Namdi nodded thoughtfully. "We must address this craving, this addiction, before it destroys us completely," he said. "I suggest that we seek guidance from the elders who are versed in our traditional healing practices. There may be a remedy to cleanse us from this curse. But we must also remember that true healing comes from within. We cannot simply rely on rituals and potions. We must begin by changing our hearts and minds." The council decided to hold a community-wide cleansing ceremony, one that would bring together all the villagers in an effort to rid themselves of Madame Ifeoma's influence. It would be a difficult and emotional process, but it was necessary. The healing would not happen overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. The ceremony was scheduled for the following week, and preparations began immediately. Villagers gathered the materials needed for the ritual: herbs, spices, and sacred oils. The community elders spent days preparing prayers and chants that would be recited during the ceremony. The night before, the village was silent, as everyone waited anxiously for the cleansing to begin. As the night of the ceremony approached, Cecilia sat alone in her small hut, her mind racing. She thought about the villagers who had died, about the families who had been torn apart by Madame Ifeoma's curse. But she also thought about the people who were still alive, the ones who were still addicted to her food, still haunted by the desire to return to the restaurant. Could the ceremony really break the spell? Or was Madame Ifeoma's curse too powerful, too deeply rooted in the village's soul? As she stared into the dim light of the fire, a sense of dread washed over her. She knew that tomorrow would be a turning point for the village, but she wasn't sure if they would truly be free from the darkness. There was still much work to be done, much healing that needed to take place. The ceremony began the next evening, under the light of a full moon. The villagers gathered in the central square, forming a large circle around the elders who stood at the center, ready to lead the ritual. The air was thick with tension, and the smell of incense filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the surrounding forest. The ritual began with the elders chanting in unison, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic pattern. The sound reverberated through the village, echoing in the hearts of everyone present. As the chants grew louder, the villagers began to feel a strange sense of unease, as though something powerful was stirring within them. The ritual reached its climax when the elders instructed everyone to pour their own personal offerings, water, salt, and herbs, into a large fire that had been built in the center of the square. One by one, the villagers stepped forward, each offering their own symbol of purification. As the fire burned brightly, something began to shift in the air. The villagers could feel it, an energy, a force, something ancient and powerful that had been awakened by their actions. It was as if the fire had absorbed their sins, their guilt, and was now purging them from their souls. For the first time in years, the villagers felt free. The heavy weight that had hung over them since Madame Ifeoma's return began to lift. They could breathe again. And as the ceremony ended, they knew that the healing process had truly begun. They would never forget the horrors they had witnessed, but they also knew that it was not too late to change, to rebuild, and to restore their community. In the days that followed, life in Nsukka began to return to normal. The villagers no longer craved Madame Ifeoma's food. They turned to their traditional dishes, made with love and care, and with a new appreciation for what they consumed. Slowly but surely, the village healed, but the scars of Madame Ifeoma's curse would never be fully erased. As for Cecilia, she found a new sense of purpose in helping the community rebuild. She worked with the elders to teach the younger generation about the dangers of unchecked desires, about the importance of community, and about the need to stay grounded in their cultural values. The village would thrive again, but this time, they would do so with a renewed respect for the balance of life. In the months that followed the cleansing ceremony, Nsukka began to rebuild its sense of identity. The villagers, once consumed by their longing for Madame Ifeoma's food, found solace in the traditional meals they had once abandoned. The market stalls, which had been nearly empty for weeks, began to fill again. Farmers started to bring fresh produce, local vendors sold freshly made pastries, and the sounds of laughter and conversation returned to the village square. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and people were beginning to rediscover the simple joys of life. But the scars of the past remained. For some, the food they had consumed at Madame Ifeoma's was now a constant reminder of the darkness they had lived through. Some villagers still felt the pull of the addiction, even though they tried to avoid the cravings. The village was not just physically affected, but spiritually wounded as well. Cecilia knew this, and she felt a deep sense of responsibility to help her community heal, not just by removing the remnants of the curse but by guiding them toward emotional and mental recovery. She worked tirelessly alongside the elders to organize regular community gatherings, encouraging people to share their experiences and talk about their fears. The collective catharsis was necessary. It wasn't enough to stop eating the food, They had to unburden themselves from the guilt and shame that had built up over the years. Cecilia believed that healing could only happen through honesty and vulnerability, so she created spaces where people could openly express the pain they had been carrying for so long. During one of these gatherings, a woman named Amara stood up. She had been a regular customer of Madame Ifeoma's, and her family had been among those most affected by the curse. Amara's children had begun to suffer from unexplained illnesses, and her husband had withdrawn into himself, becoming distant and ill-tempered. For years, she had watched as the darkness slowly consumed her family. She had long suspected that the food was the cause, but it wasn't until the truth came out that she fully understood the depth of the damage. "I never knew how deeply I had been affected until the ceremony," Amara said, her voice trembling. "It's like the addiction didn't just stay in my body, it stayed in my mind. I'm still haunted by the taste of her food. I keep craving it even now." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "I feel guilty for every time I fed my children that meat, knowing something wasn't right, but never questioning it." The room fell silent, and Amara's confession seemed to hang in the air. It was a moment of painful but necessary truth. Cecilia stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Amara's shoulder. "What you are feeling is normal," Cecilia said softly. "This is the part of the healing process that is hardest to face, the emotional scars. You are not alone in this. Every single one of us has been touched by Madame Ifeoma's curse, and we must face that together." The villagers nodded in agreement, offering their support to Amara. The acknowledgement of their shared pain was the first step toward healing. They understood that there was no shame in their struggle. The shame lay in the silence they had kept for so long. Slowly but surely, the collective burden began to lift as they began to speak the unspeakable and share their experiences. Meanwhile, Cecilia began to work closely with Elder Uche, who had taken it upon himself to find ways to restore the community's trust in the food they ate. Elder Uche was an expert in the village's traditional herbal medicine, and believed that the healing process could not only be emotional but physical as well. He knew that many of the villagers still suffered from lingering effects, physical weaknesses, low energy, and digestive problems, as a result of the tainted food. One day, Elder Uche invited Cecilia to the forest to gather herbs. "We need to cleanse the land," he said, his voice grave. "The water, the soil, and the air, they all carry the energy of the curse. It's our responsibility to restore balance. We must purify everything." Cecilia followed him deep into the forest, where they gathered various herbs known for their purifying properties. As they collected roots, leaves, and flowers, Elder Uche spoke of the ancient rituals that had been passed down for generations. "Our ancestors knew how to balance the energies of the earth," he explained. "They knew that every action, whether it's planting, harvesting, or even eating, affects the spiritual and physical health of the land. We've lost that knowledge, but it's not too late to restore it." The ritual to purify the land would take several days, but Cecilia was determined to do everything she could to help her village heal. She believed that the journey to recovery would require patience and effort, but if they truly wanted to cleanse themselves from Madame Ifeoma's curse, they would need to reconnect with the land, with their ancestors, and with the food that had nourished them for centuries. As weeks turned into months, the healing process continued, though it was not always smooth. Some villagers, particularly the younger generation, were skeptical about the traditional ways. They had grown accustomed to convenience and modernity, and the old customs seemed foreign and irrelevant to them. Cecilia understood their hesitation. She, too, had once felt disconnected from her heritage, but she had come to realize that the traditions of their ancestors held the keys to their survival and well-being. To bridge the gap, Cecilia started a new project. She began teaching the younger generation about the herbs and plants that their forebears had used, showing them how to prepare meals using traditional methods. "We've forgotten the power of our food," Cecilia said during one of her lessons. "The right food can heal us not just physically but spiritually. We've been eating to fill our bellies, but we need to eat to nourish our souls." At first, the younger villagers were hesitant, But as they learned about the healing properties of the foods they had once taken for granted, they began to appreciate the deeper connection between the land and their bodies. Slowly, the village started to embrace the idea of eating mindfully and with purpose. They started growing their own crops again, focusing on organic, traditional farming practices. They made sure to bless the soil before planting, offering gratitude for the nourishment it would provide. But not all was perfect. Even as the villagers grew stronger, Cecilia could sense an undercurrent of fear. There were whispers that Madame Ifeoma's spirit still lingered, that her wrath would one day return to haunt them again. Some of the elders, particularly those who had known her as Adiku, warned against becoming complacent. "The darkness she brought into our village was not just about food," Elder Namdi said one evening, his voice heavy with concern. "It was about the corruption of our hearts. We must remain vigilant, or we risk falling into the same trap again." Cecilia listened carefully to the elders' warnings. She knew that their recovery was fragile, and they had to stay true to their newfound values. They could not allow themselves to be tempted by greed or convenience again. The lessons they had learned during the dark days of Madame Ifeoma's reign were hard-earned, and they had to honor them by living with integrity. As the seasons changed, so did the village. The once barren fields were now full of vibrant crops, cassava, yams, maize, and beans, all growing in harmony with the land. The food was no longer just about filling their stomachs. It was about connecting with the earth and each other. The village had reclaimed its power. One evening, as Cecilia stood in the market square, watching the villagers go about their business, she felt a deep sense of peace. It had taken time, but they had come together and overcome the darkness. The memory of Madame Ifeoma's curse would never fully fade, but it was no longer the defining chapter of their story. In the distance, she saw Amara and her family returning from the fields, their faces alight with happiness. Amara had started a small garden of her own, growing the herbs and vegetables that would provide the foundation for her family's meals. Her children, once weak and sickly, were now healthy and full of life. The change in them was a testament to the power of healing, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Cecilia smiled, knowing that the village had not just survived, they had thrived. The journey had been long and the scars remained, but they had found a way to heal. The food they ate was no longer just sustenance. It was a sacred act, a symbol of their resilience and their deep connection to the land. As Nsukka continued to heal, the villagers embraced a renewed sense of purpose. What had once been a sleepy, struggling community had transformed into something more unified and self-sustaining. The market was alive with bustling activity, filled with vendors peddling fresh produce, handcrafted goods, and freshly baked breads. The air was thick with the smell of traditional soups, earthy stews, and sizzling meats cooked over open fires. It wasn't the same as Madame Ifeoma's cursed restaurant, but the food had gained a deeper meaning now. Every dish was a reflection of their resilience, their return to their roots, and their desire to live with integrity. The youth of the village began to show more interest in the traditions of their ancestors, a movement that Cecilia had started by teaching them how to use the herbs and plants that had once been their family's lifeblood. The traditional foods were no longer viewed as old-fashioned. They were seen as symbols of connection to the earth, to history, and to family. Cecilia spent hours each week with the younger generations, teaching them how to harvest yams, cultivate maize, and prepare the meals that had once nourished their people. It was a long road, but the young ones embraced their heritage with pride, finding joy in the simplicity of a good meal prepared from the earth they had learned to honor. As the months passed, Cecilia noticed a change in the villagers' attitudes. There was a deeper sense of respect for each other, a new consciousness about how the collective well-being of the village was tied to the choices they made. No longer did they blindly rush to consume what they desired without considering the long-term impact. Madame Ifeoma's curse had forced them to reckon with the consequences of their actions, and they had learned to be more mindful. This new way of thinking not only shaped their food choices but also influenced how they related to one another. There was an unspoken rule among them now that their prosperity as a village depended on their ability to care for the community, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. But even as the village prospered, there were those who could not fully release the shadows of the past. Some elders, particularly those who had known Adiku, the woman who had once been part of their lives, continued to whisper about the possibility of a second curse. They remembered the terrible misfortune that had befallen Adiku's family. They recalled the tragic loss of her children, her husband's untimely death, and the strange disappearance of her father. Many of them feared that Madame Ifeoma's evil spirit could return, creeping into their midst once more. These fears were most strongly felt among the elders who had been part of the decision to banish her from the village all those years ago. They carried a sense of guilt, wondering if their actions in expelling her had somehow contributed to her transformation into the wicked being she had become. Elder Namdi, a wise and thoughtful man, spent many sleepless nights worrying about the spiritual consequences of the curse. "The past cannot be undone," he would say, often to himself, staring into the flickering light of his fire. "But the consequences of our actions still linger in our hearts and in our souls. We cannot ignore the darker side of life, no matter how much we want to." Cecilia noticed the concern that still gripped the village's leaders. Even as the younger villagers embraced the healing process, there were quiet gatherings held among the elders, where talk of spiritual cleansing and purging persisted. They knew that the final step in their healing would require more than physical or emotional recovery. It would demand a reckoning with the very forces that had nearly destroyed them. One evening, after a particularly long day of teaching, Cecilia walked to the edge of the village, where she could look out over the fields. The sun had just begun to set, casting a soft golden light over the landscape. In the distance, she could hear the sound of children laughing as they played near the river, their voices a joyful reminder of the vibrancy that had returned to the village. But there was a stillness inside her, a quiet unease that had taken root. Despite all the progress they had made, Cecilia could not shake the feeling that they were still not fully free from the lingering power of Madame Ifeoma. She had often heard whispers in the wind, in the rustling of the trees, of the spirit of Madame Ifeoma, a presence that some believed could never truly be eradicated. Could the curse have truly been lifted? Could their hard-won peace last? Or would the forces that had once consumed the village return again, stronger than ever, in a new and more insidious form? It was at that moment that a figure appeared at the edge of the field. At first, Cecilia thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but as the figure drew closer, she recognized the woman. It was Amara, the same woman who had once confessed her guilt and despair at the community gathering. Her eyes were wide, her expression tense. "Something's wrong," Amara said, her voice tinged with fear. "I've been having dreams again, dreams of her. Madame Ifeoma. She's coming back, Cecilia. Can feel it. I've been hearing whispers in the night. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but now I'm not so sure. I see her face in my dreams, and I hear her voice, whispering that she'll never leave us. That the curse isn't over." Cecilia's heart tightened in her chest. She had feared this moment, the moment when the darkness that had gripped their village would return. Despite the rituals, despite the cleansing, there were those who believed that Madame Ifeoma's spirit was still present in the land, waiting for the right moment to strike again. "We can't ignore this, Cecilia," Amara continued, her voice shaking. "We need to act before it's too late. I don't know what else to do." Cecilia felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "I hear you, Amara," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need to go to the elders. We need to do something before this curse takes hold of us again." The two women hurried to the elders' meeting place. Elder Namdi, who had always been one of the most practical of the elders, listened intently as Cecilia and Amara described the unsettling dreams and whispers. He sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "I had feared this day would come," Elder Namdi said finally, his voice filled with both sorrow and wisdom. "We may have purged the physical curse, but the spirit of Madame Ifeoma, the spirit of Adiku, was always tied to something deeper. Her anger, her sorrow, her desire for revenge. They have left a stain on this land, one that cannot be erased by rituals alone. We must confront the source of her pain, or it will continue to haunt us." He paused, looking at each elder around the circle, then at Cecilia and Amara. The curse is not just a physical one. It is a spiritual burden that is carried by the land itself. And to truly break free from it, we must perform a final, sacred ritual, a confrontation with the spirit of Madame Ifeoma, to bring peace to her restless soul. The ritual that Elder Namdi described was one that had not been performed in the village for generations. It was a complex, deeply sacred ceremony, one that would require the villagers to face the very spirit that had caused them so much pain. They would need to go into the heart of the forest, the very place where Ataku had once wandered alone, cursing her fate, and confront the forces that had turned her into Madame Ifeoma. The ritual was not without its risks. There was the possibility that the spirit would grow stronger, that the confrontation would turn violent, that the village would face even greater destruction. But the elders were resolute. The curse could never truly be lifted until they faced the woman who had brought the darkness upon them. "We cannot allow this fear to control us any longer," Elder Namdi said. "We must end this cycle once and for all." In the days leading up to the ritual, the village grew tense. The younger generation was both excited and nervous. For them, the ceremony was something of a legend, a myth passed down through the stories of their elders. But to those who had lived through the horrors of Madame Ifeoma's reign, the thought of confronting her spirit was terrifying. The nights grew darker, and the whispers of Madame Ifeoma's return seemed to echo louder in the wind. Finally, the day of the ritual arrived. The villagers gathered at the edge of the forest, where the trees grew tall and the shadows stretched long. Elder Namdi led the procession, his voice calm but commanding as he spoke the ancient prayers that had been passed down through the generations. Cecilia walked beside him, her heart heavy with anticipation. The air was thick with tension, as if the very earth beneath their feet was holding its breath. The villagers exhaled in unison, the weight of the tension lifting from the air. Cecilia stood in the center of the clearing, her heart still racing, but she could feel it. The spirit had gone. The curse had been broken. For the first time in years they were truly free. The elders ceased their chant, and the village fell into a quiet, reverent stillness. Elder Namdi lowered his staff. His eyes closed in a moment of reflection. "It is done," he said softly. "We have freed ourselves from the darkness that has plagued us." The villagers gathered together, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion. They had confronted their past, faced the spirit that had haunted them, and emerged victorious. There was still much work to be done, but now they could begin anew. As they made their way back to the village, the air seemed lighter, the world a little brighter. The journey had been long and difficult, but the village had endured. They had faced their darkest fears and emerged stronger for it. The villagers knew that they would always remember the lessons they had learned, the importance of community, integrity, and the balance between desire and restraint. Cecilia looked up at the sky as they walked, the setting sun casting a warm, golden glow over the village. They had come full circle. The land had been healed, the curse had been broken, and the village had reclaimed its future. They would move forward together, stronger and wiser than before. The journey back to the village was long, but the weight that had once crushed the villagers' spirits was now lifted. As they walked, the air seemed fresher, lighter, as if the earth itself had exhaled a long-held breath. The trees no longer loomed ominously around them. Instead, they stood tall, proud, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. The tension that had hung over Nsukka for so many months had dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of hope and unity. Cecilia walked alongside Elder Namdi, her heart still racing from the intensity of the ritual, but her thoughts slowly returning to the next steps. The villagers had been through so much, and now it was time to rebuild, to ensure that the dark shadow of Madame Ifeoma's legacy would never return. As the group neared the edge of the forest, Cecilia felt a deep sense of accomplishment mixed with anticipation. The future of Nsukka was now in their hands, and they had to be vigilant, ensuring that the lessons they had learned were passed on to the next generation. The village square was quiet when they returned, but there was a palpable change in the air. The people had sensed the transformation that had taken place in the forest, and they waited, eager to hear the news from the elders. Cecilia, Elder Namdi, and the others entered the square, their faces filled with determination. The villagers gathered around them, their eyes searching for answers, for confirmation that the curse had indeed been broken. Elder Namdi raised his hand, calling for silence. "The spirit of Madam Ifeoma has been confronted and banished," he said, his voice strong and unwavering. "We have broken the curse that has plagued this village for so long. But the work is not yet over. The land has been cleansed, but we must now cleanse our hearts, our minds, and our spirits. We must rebuild from within." There was a collective sigh of relief among the villagers, but also an undercurrent of unease. They had faced their fears and emerged victorious, but they knew that the battle for their souls was not yet won. Madam Ifeoma's curse had left a deep scar on their community, and it would take time for that wound to heal. Cecilia stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with compassion. "The work we've done in the forest was necessary, but it is not enough," she said. "We cannot simply remove the darkness from the land and expect everything to be restored. We must rebuild from the ground up, but we must also be mindful of the choices we make. Our community has learned the hard way that our desires can lead us astray. We must now learn to live with intention, to honor the earth, and to care for one another with the same love and respect that we have for the land." The villagers listened intently, their eyes reflecting the deep understanding of what she was saying. They had seen firsthand the power of Madam Ifeoma's influence, the way it had preyed on their cravings and weaknesses. They had been caught in a cycle of addiction, of desire, that had nearly torn them apart. But now they knew better. They knew that the path forward would require mindfulness, patience, and care. Over the next few weeks, the village began its slow but steady recovery. The market was bustling again, but this time it was different. People were no longer rushing to fill their bellies with food that could never truly satisfy them. They were taking their time, savoring the food they had grown themselves, prepared with love and respect. There was a renewed sense of connection not just with the earth but with each other. The people had learned to value the land, and in doing so, they had learned to value themselves and one another. The younger generation, who had once been indifferent to their traditions, now looked to the elders for guidance. Cecilia had become a mentor to many of them, teaching them the lessons of the past, the importance of respecting the land, and the dangers of excess. The old ways were no longer seen as outdated. They were a source of wisdom, a guide for living with balance and harmony. Cecilia's days were filled with teaching, guiding, and rebuilding. She worked closely with Elder Namdi to create a curriculum that would pass on the knowledge of the ancestors to the next generation. They began holding community classes, where villagers of all ages came together to learn about herbal medicine, sustainable farming, and the importance of spiritual balance. The community began to hold regular gatherings, not just for work, but for connection. They would meet in the village square to share stories, celebrate milestones, and support each other through times of difficulty. The bonds that had been weakened by Madam Ifeoma's curse were now stronger than ever, forged through shared experience and mutual care. But even as the village prospered, Cecilia knew that they had to remain vigilant. The darkness that had once taken root in their hearts had not disappeared completely. The whispers of Madam Ifeoma's spirit still lingered in the wind, in the shadows of the trees. It was tempting to believe that they were free, that the curse had been broken for good. But Cecilia knew better. The true test of their healing would come in the years to come. As Cecilia stood in the village square one evening, watching the children play near the river, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The village had come a long way, and there was still much work to be done. But for the first time in years, there was hope in the air. The villagers had learned the value of patience, of mindfulness, and of living in harmony with the earth. They had reclaimed their power, and with it, their future. But Cecilia also knew that they could never forget the lessons of the past. Madam Ifeoma's spirit had been banished, but the scars of her curse would always remain. The village would continue to rebuild, but they would do so with awareness, with respect for the land, and with a commitment to living in balance. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The village of Nsukka had transformed into something new, something stronger. The people no longer rushed through their lives, consumed by desire and greed. They moved with purpose, with care, and with a deep understanding of the connection between their actions and the world around them. Cecilia continued to guide the village, but she knew that one day, the next generation would take up the mantle. They would continue to live by the lessons they had learned, and they would pass those lessons on to their children. The legacy of Madame Ifeoma's curse would be nothing more than a story to tell, a story of the past, of what had been, and of what they had overcome. And as the years passed, the people of Nsukka would never forget the trials they had faced. They would remember the darkness, the fear, and the pain, but they would also remember the strength, the unity, and the resilience that had brought them through. One evening, as Cecilia stood at the edge of the village, looking out over the fields that had once been barren, she felt a quiet peace settle in her heart. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the land. The crops were thriving, the market was full of life, and the village was thriving. The land had been healed, and so had the people. They had faced their darkest fears, confronted the curse that had threatened to consume them, and emerged stronger for it. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Nsukka was no longer a village bound by fear and greed. It was a village reborn, a village where the earth was honored, where the people cared for one another, and where the lessons of the past were never forgotten. Cecilia smiled as she watched the children play, their laughter filling the air. She knew that the cycle of darkness had been broken. The village was free. Years passed, and the village of Nsukka flourished. What was once a place of despair, tainted by the dark influence of Madame Ifeoma's curse, had become a thriving community, grounded in a deep respect for the land, their ancestors, and each other. Cecilia's role as a mentor and guide had cemented her as a central figure in the village, and under her leadership, Nsukka became known beyond its borders for its commitment to sustainability, unity, and spiritual well-being. The village became a symbol of hope, a beacon of recovery in a world that often felt lost and disconnected. People from neighboring villages came to Nsukka to learn from their example, seeking guidance on how to rebuild their own communities, to live with intention and purpose. Nsukka had become a living testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of collective healing. Cecilia, now a seasoned leader, often reflected on how far the village had come. The memories of the darkness and fear that had once hung over them were still vivid in her mind, but they were no longer a source of sorrow. Instead, they were a reminder of the resilience that had carried them through. One morning, as the sun rose over the fields, Cecilia sat by the riverbank, watching the water flow peacefully by. The landscape before her was unrecognizable from what it had been years ago. The once barren fields now flourished with crops, the trees lining the river were full of fruit, and the air smelled sweet with the promise of abundance. She had seen firsthand the power of nature to heal, to restore balance, and she marveled at how the land had responded to the villagers' commitment to living in harmony with it. It was during these moments of quiet reflection that Cecilia felt most connected to the village's journey. She had been a part of their transformation, guiding them through their darkest times, but she knew that the true strength had come from within the people themselves. They had taken the lessons she had shared, and with them they had rebuilt their lives, one step at a time. Cecilia's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw a young woman walking toward her, a familiar face in the crowd. It was Amara, who had been one of the first to speak up during the healing process, sharing her own struggles with the curse and her path toward redemption. Now, Amara stood before her with a smile, a different energy about her than the one Cecilia had first encountered. "Good morning, Cecilia," Amara said, her voice light and full of warmth. "I was hoping I could speak with you." Cecilia smiled, rising to greet her. "Of course, Amara. What's on your mind?" Amara's face softened, her eyes filled with a quiet pride. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, the curse, the ceremony, the rebuilding, and I realize that I've learned so much from all of it. Not just about the land but about myself. About what I value, about what truly matters. I want to help others in the same way you helped me." Cecilia nodded, her heart swelling with pride. Amara had come such a long way. You've been a beacon of strength, Amara. Your journey has been one of the most beautiful transformations I've witnessed in this village. Amara's smile deepened, but there was a certain sadness in her eyes. I know. But I also know that the journey never truly ends. I want to learn more about our traditions, about the healing powers of the land, and how I can help others who may still be struggling with their own burdens. There are still people in the village who are afraid to confront their past, who haven't yet found peace. Cecilia took a deep breath, understanding the weight of Amara's words. Healing is a lifelong process. It's not something that happens overnight, no matter how much we wish it would. The most important thing is that we continue to support each other, to help each other find strength when it feels impossible. Amara nodded, a determined glint in her eyes. I know. I want to work with the elders, learn the deeper aspects of our traditions, and perhaps even teach the younger generations about what we've learned. We can't let the mistakes of the past be forgotten. Cecilia smiled, placing a hand on Amara's shoulder. You're ready, Amara. Your heart is in the right place. The village needs people like you. I'm proud of you. The conversation left a lasting impression on Cecilia. Amara had become not just a survivor, but a true leader in her own right. And as she watched the young woman walk back toward the village, Cecilia couldn't help but feel that the cycle of healing and growth was continuing. The wisdom of the elders was being passed down to the next generation, and with it, the village's legacy of resilience and unity would endure. As the years went by, Nsukka became known throughout the region not only for its agricultural success but also for its spiritual wisdom. Elder Namdi, who had been a guiding force in the village's recovery, became a mentor to other villages, sharing his knowledge of the old ways and the importance of spiritual harmony. He worked alongside Cecilia, ensuring that the teachings of their ancestors were preserved and passed on to the younger generation. The villagers, particularly the youth, began to form small study groups where they would meet regularly to learn about their culture, the land, and their shared history. They also began to explore new ways to merge the old and new, blending modern technologies with ancient wisdom. The younger generation sought to create a balance between progress and tradition, never losing sight of the lessons their elders had taught them. One such young person was Kofi, a curious and bright young man who had been part of the group that had first acknowledged the curse. He had been among the first to embrace the idea of returning to traditional farming methods, and now he was spearheading the village's efforts to expand their agricultural reach. He had worked closely with Cecilia and Elder Namdi to develop sustainable farming techniques that used natural fertilizers and crop rotation, ensuring that the land remained fertile for generations to come. Kofi had also started a small program that invited neighboring villages to come and learn about sustainable farming practices. He believed that in order for the region to prosper, everyone needed to work together to protect the land that sustained them. Under his guidance, the village not only became a beacon of sustainability but also a hub for agricultural education. As Kofi walked through the fields, watching the workers harvest the crops, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. This was more than just farming, it was about restoring balance. They had healed the land, and in doing so, they had healed themselves. It wasn't just about the crops they grew. It was about the future they were building for their children. One afternoon, Cecilia sat in the village square, watching the preparations for a grand celebration that was to mark the anniversary of the breaking of the curse. It had been a year since the villagers had confronted Madame Ifeoma's spirit, and now they were ready to celebrate their journey, their victories, and their growth. The village was abuzz with activity as everyone worked together to prepare for the feast. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, singing, and the rhythmic beat of drums. The children ran around, chasing each other and playing games, while the adults worked together to prepare the traditional dishes that had sustained their ancestors for generations. As Cecilia looked around, she saw the fruits of their labor, the unity, the strength, and the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but they had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more connected to each other and to the earth. Cecilia knew that the road ahead would not always be easy. There would always be challenges, and there would always be those who struggled to find their way. But she also knew that as long as the village held fast to the lessons they had learned, they would continue to thrive. As the evening approached and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the village, Cecilia stood on the balcony of her home, looking out at the peaceful landscape. The sound of drums and songs echoed through the air, and she could hear the laughter of the villagers drifting on the breeze. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the beauty of the night. The stars were beginning to twinkle above, each one a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the interconnectedness of all things. She had seen so much in her life, but this was the most beautiful thing of all. The village had healed, and so had she. The lessons of the past, the pain, the sorrow, and the fear, had all brought them here to this moment of peace. And Cecilia knew that the journey would continue, with each generation taking up the mantle of healing, living, and growing. The village of Nsukka was not just a place, it was a living testament to the strength of the human spirit. And with that thought, Cecilia smiled, knowing that the future was bright. The celebration in Nsukka was more than just a festivity. It was a reflection of everything the village had fought for, a symbol of their collective healing, their unity, and their unwavering strength. The drums beat louder as the night wore on, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate with the heartbeat of the land itself. Laughter filled the air, mingling with the melodies of songs passed down through generations. There was a sense of joy and peace that was palpable, a shared understanding that they had overcome the darkest of times and emerged victorious. Cecilia stood in the heart of the village square, watching as the community danced together. The younger generation, who had once been skeptical of the old ways, now moved gracefully in step with the elders, their bodies swaying to the music in a perfect harmony that was both symbolic and profound. The healing had come full circle. The ancient rhythms that had once been relegated to the past were now alive again, woven into the very fabric of their present. As the night deepened, Cecilia noticed Amara standing near the bonfire, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. Amara had become a leader in her own right, having worked with Elder Namdi and Cecilia to pass on the wisdom of their ancestors. She had taken the lessons of the past and made them her own, helping to guide the village's next generation toward a future built on balance, respect, and unity. Cecilia made her way over to Amara, a sense of pride swelling within her. Amara had been a vital part of this transformation, and watching her now, standing as a beacon of strength and wisdom, filled Cecilia with a deep sense of fulfillment. "You've done well, Amara," Cecilia said, her voice filled with affection. Amara turned, her smile radiant. "I couldn't have done it without you, Cecilia. I've learned so much from you, and now I'm finally beginning to understand what it means to live with intention and purpose." Cecilia nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "You've made the lessons your own, and now you're teaching others. That's the legacy we're building. Each generation must learn and teach, to ensure that we never forget the strength that's within us." Amara's smile softened. "We've come a long way. I know I still have much to learn, but I feel more connected to my ancestors and the earth than I ever have before. The village has healed, and so have I." The two women stood in silence for a moment, watching the celebration unfold before them. The flames of the bonfire danced in the cool night air, casting shadows that flickered like memories on the faces of the villagers. It was a moment of peace, a moment of reflection. They had broken the chains of the past, and now they were free. As the celebration wound down and the villagers began to disperse, Cecilia retired to her home, her mind still buzzing with the events of the night. The work of healing had not been easy, but it had been worth every moment. She had watched the village transform before her eyes, and as the night sky stretched out above her, she couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude for the journey they had all taken together. She sat outside her home, looking up at the stars. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of the firewood from the celebration. It was a quiet moment, but it was one filled with understanding. The land had been healed, but so had the people. It wasn't just about confronting the darkness of the past. It was about learning to live with the lessons that had been passed down, embracing the wisdom of the elders, and passing it on to those who would come after them. The next morning, Cecilia awoke early, as was her habit. She stepped outside, greeted by the golden rays of the sun breaking through the horizon. The world was still, the earth beneath her feet solid and sure. She had come to appreciate the quiet moments of the early morning, the time when the village was still asleep, and she could reflect on the progress they had made without distractions. It was in these moments that she felt closest to the land and to the wisdom of her ancestors. She took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh air, and felt a profound sense of peace. The community had embraced its new identity, and it was thriving. There was still work to be done, of course. Healing was a lifelong process, and the land required constant care. But Cecilia knew that the people of Nsukka were more than capable of continuing this journey. They had learned the value of patience, the importance of balance, and the power of community. As the days went by, the village's strength only grew. The once feeble efforts to reconnect with nature had become a sustainable and thriving way of life. The crops grew stronger with each passing season, and the market continued to bustle with life, full of fresh produce, handmade goods, and the vibrant energy of the people who had committed to this transformation. Kofi, the young man who had taken the village's agricultural efforts to the next level, stood at the forefront of this evolution. Under his leadership, Nsukka's sustainable farming practices had become a model for surrounding villages. The village had begun to export its surplus crops, and it wasn't just about economics. It was about spreading the message of unity and sustainability. Kofi had become a young leader, deeply connected to his roots, but also willing to embrace new technologies that could enhance their way of life without compromising their values. He often visited neighboring villages, teaching them about crop rotation, composting, and the sacred rituals that were tied to the harvest. His work had earned him respect from the elders, who saw him as a bridge between the traditional and modern ways of life. Kofi had become a mentor in his own right, teaching the younger generation how to grow food that nourished not just the body but the soul. The village's transformation had ripple effects far beyond Nsukka. Word of their recovery spread quickly, and people from distant lands began to seek out the village for guidance. Nsukka became a center for spiritual growth and sustainable living. What had once been a community devastated by a curse was now a place of pilgrimage, a place where others could come to learn, to heal, and to reconnect with the earth. Cecilia, Amara, Elder Namdi, and Kofi were regularly sought after by travelers, each of whom sought wisdom in different forms. Some came to learn about the traditional farming practices, others to study the ancient spiritual rituals that had healed the land. But they all left with more than they had expected. They left with a renewed sense of purpose, a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. As the years passed, the younger generations continued to uphold the values instilled in them by their elders. The story of Madame Ifioma, once a tale of fear and suffering, was now a lesson in resilience. It was shared not to remind them of the darkness they had overcome, but to teach future generations about the importance of living in harmony with the earth, of understanding the power of desires, and of recognizing the strength that comes from community. The people of Nsukka never stopped learning, never stopped growing. They had become stewards of the land, not just in a physical sense, but in a spiritual one. They understood that true healing didn't come from a single event or ceremony. It came from daily acts of care, mindfulness, and respect. It came from a commitment to building a future where the mistakes of the past were not repeated but learned from. One evening, as Cecilia walked through the fields with Amara, they paused to watch the sun dip below the horizon. The golden light bathed the land, casting long shadows across the earth. The crops were ready for harvest, and the village had come together to celebrate the fruits of their labor. Cecilia turned to Amara, her voice filled with quiet pride. "Look at what we've built. Look at what we've become." Amara smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "We've become more than just a village. We've become a community, a family." Cecilia nodded. "Yes, and that's what will carry us forward. Together." The sun finally set, and the village settled into the peace of another evening, knowing that no matter what challenges the future held, they would face it together, united in their strength, their wisdom, and their love for the earth. Over the years, the village of Nsukka continued to thrive in ways they had never imagined. The success they had achieved wasn't just limited to their agricultural practices or their ability to sustain themselves. It was evident in every facet of their lives, from their social dynamics to the way they engaged with the earth, and how they embraced education and cultural preservation. The village had become a hub for other communities seeking to adopt similar practices of balance, unity, and sustainable living. Cecilia often reflected on how much the village had changed since the days when Madame Ifeoma's curse had clouded their lives. At the time, they had been divided, searching for something to fill the void in their hearts, and lost in the grip of desire and consumption. Now they had learned that fulfillment came not from excess, but from gratitude, balance, and a deep connection to the land. This was the lesson that would continue to resonate through generations. However, even with all the progress, Cecilia was mindful that true peace required constant vigilance. The journey of healing was ongoing, and the village needed to continuously work together to protect what they had built. The temptation to fall back into old ways was always present, especially in a world where quick solutions and material wealth often promised easy answers. It was with this sense of awareness that Cecilia and the elders decided to create a new institution in the village, the School of Sustainability. The school wasn't just a place for learning. It was a living space where wisdom and tradition could be shared, where the principles of balance between the earth, the spirit, and the community were taught. The School of Sustainability would be built on the old ways but would incorporate modern knowledge in areas like environmental science, renewable energy, and ecology. The purpose of the school was clear: to ensure that the future generations would have the tools they needed to continue the work that had begun with their elders, to sustain the lessons learned from the past, and to confront the challenges that would inevitably arise as the world around them changed. Kofi, with his knowledge of modern farming techniques and commitment to sustainability, was appointed the head of the school. He saw the opportunity not just as a responsibility but as a privilege. He was in a position to shape the next generation's connection to the earth. He worked tirelessly alongside Elder Namdi and Cecilia to curate the curriculum that would ensure the preservation of the village's core values, while still empowering the youth with the practical skills needed to thrive in the modern world. The school's first year was a success beyond what Cecilia had hoped. The students, some as young as 8, others as old as 18, came from Nsukka and surrounding villages, eager to learn about the land, sustainable agriculture, and the spiritual practices that had once saved their community. They studied herbal medicine, traditional farming, and spiritual rituals, but they also learned about environmental conservation, climate change, and modern ecological practices. It was a fusion of the old and the new, and the students found it invigorating. For the first time in history, young men and women from Nsukka were empowered to make decisions that affected their community and beyond. They were no longer passive recipients of knowledge. They were active participants in the evolution of their society. Cecilia had envisioned this, a generation of leaders who were grounded in the wisdom of their ancestors, but also equipped to deal with the challenges of the modern world. As Kofi watched the students take ownership of their learning, he was filled with a quiet sense of pride. The future of Nsukka was secure in their hands. These young people were ready to carry the torch forward, armed with knowledge and a sense of responsibility to their land and their people. The village continued to receive visitors, some in awe of the progress they had made, others seeking advice on how to rebuild their own communities. Nsukka had become a model of sustainable living, and with that recognition came opportunities. Cecilia worked with the elders to ensure that any resources the village shared would be used to further the ideals of balance and sustainability. She was careful not to let the outside world, with its rapid pace of growth and consumption, influence the village's values. One such visitor was a politician from the nearby city of Enugu. He had heard about the village's success and wanted to know how Nsukka had transformed so dramatically. As he sat with Cecilia, Amara, and Elder Namdi, he was intrigued by the village's resilience and its return to traditional farming practices. "I've heard a lot about what you've done here," the politician said, "and it's impressive. But with the world changing so fast, don't you think it might be difficult to maintain this way of life? There's so much pressure to modernize, to keep up with the rest of the world." Cecilia met his gaze, her expression steady. "Yes, there is pressure to modernize. But we've learned that modernization doesn't mean abandoning our values or traditions. Our way of life is not a rejection of progress. It's a response to the imbalance we've witnessed in the world. Our village has prospered not because we've clung to the past, but because we've embraced a way of life that honors both the land and the future. It's about balance, taking the best of both worlds. The politician looked at her thoughtfully. So, you're saying the world doesn't have to choose between progress and preservation? Exactly, Cecilia replied. We don't have to destroy the earth to move forward. We can find a way to coexist with nature and modernity. We've learned this lesson the hard way, and now it's our duty to share it with others. The politician, visibly moved, nodded slowly. I see your point. Perhaps there's something we can learn from your village. Maybe it's time for the government to invest in sustainable practices that can create jobs, protect the environment, and build a stronger, more resilient future. Cecilia smiled, though her heart remained cautious. She understood the complexities of working within larger systems. She had seen firsthand how easily well-meaning efforts could become distorted by greed or political agendas. She wasn't sure if the politician's interest would translate into real change, but she was willing to work toward that possibility, as long as it didn't compromise the values that had brought Nsukka to where it was today. Change is always possible, Cecilia said. But we must be careful about how we implement it. True progress comes when people work together, when they value the earth and each other. I would be happy to help in any way that respects those principles. As the years passed, Nsukka remained a beacon of hope and a model for the surrounding communities. The School of Sustainability became a cornerstone of the village's legacy, and the village's influence began to spread beyond its borders. People came from all over the country to witness the transformation and to learn about the balance between tradition and modernity. One of the key projects that emerged from this influence was the Green Earth Initiative, a national program dedicated to promoting sustainable farming and eco-friendly practices across Nigeria. The initiative, inspired by Nsukka's example, received support from both local governments and international organizations. Kofi and Amara were invited to lead workshops and share their knowledge with other villages, while Cecilia continued to serve as an advisor to the program. Despite the successes, the villagers never lost sight of the most important lesson they had learned: the need for constant care, awareness, and respect. The village had become a symbol of sustainability, but it had also become a living example of the power of collective effort. They knew that the future depended not just on how much they harvested or how much they taught, but on how deeply they remained connected to each other and the earth. On the 10th anniversary of the breaking of Madame Ifeoma's curse, the village held a grand ceremony. The entire community gathered at the edge of the forest, near the stone altar where the confrontation had taken place. The altar was no longer a symbol of fear, but a reminder of the strength and resilience of the people. The ceremony was filled with music, dance, and prayers of thanksgiving to the ancestors, honoring the land, and celebrating the spirit of unity that had carried them through the darkest of times. Cecilia stood at the front of the gathering, her heart full as she looked out over the village. The faces in the crowd reflected a deep sense of pride and peace. This was their moment, a culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and healing. As she raised her hands to the sky, she offered a silent prayer of gratitude for all they had accomplished. The wind seemed to carry her words, and as she lowered her arms, she knew that the work they had done was just the beginning. The legacy of Nsukka, rooted in the principles of balance, respect, and unity, would endure for generations to come.